Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm Paul TX141 Walsh, welcoming you to some all new World of Warships gameplay today on our channel. In this episode we'll be featuring the Tier 5 German cruiser, the Konigsberg, in a Tier 5 domination game on the map Strait. The purpose of today's video is for us to articulate how the recent buff to German high explosive as of patch 0.6.6 has benefited the Konigsberg in particular. Now, just to provide some background, I absolutely love this ship in general. I love its phenomenal range, i.e. that 16.5km range on its 3 triple batteries mounted in AXY configuration, and that 7.5 second reload time makes this ship a very nice long range engagement ship. One that can kite foes thanks to the fact you have 2 rear turrets rather than 2 frontal turrets, and that means that 66% of your firepower is concentrated in the rear for kiting style gameplay. Now, with the recent patch, you may be wondering, what exactly does it mean? Well, German high explosive shells on cruisers now have a penetration factor whereby their penetration is a quarter of their shell caliber. So in the case of the Konigsberg 150mm cannon, shell penetration on the high explosive is now 37.5mm, or if you round it up, 38mm. You've essentially been given IFHE for free, i.e. that 4-point captain skill, which is loved for cruisers, especially in the tier 6 region, whereby their guns are within calibers of 150 to 155mm. So does this mean that you should just start spamming high explosive for now and not have to worry as much about armour piercing? Because German armour piercing does have a reputation for being incredibly powerful at most ranges, so long as the opponent shows a completely flat broadside. Well, we're hoping to articulate that whilst the buff is nice, it just adds variety to these ships. It does not mean that you should just be going for high explosive all the time, and that the armour piercing still has its place, as we try to lob someone to the tier 4 French cruiser, which I can't pronounce its name properly, I just call it a Dougie. So lobbing our shells in, we very quickly switch to the Nicholas in front of us, the tier 5 American destroyer that's trying to capture Alpha, and seems to have put themselves in a rather exposed position to our friendly Isokaze, who's going to be cutting across in front of us, as we try to knock out the propulsion on that Nicholas to slow them down. Unfortunately getting 3 hits, but no module damage. Now, one thing to always note is that German high explosive in general, from my understanding, is the weakest high explosive of all the nations currently in game, or the ones whose tech trees have been populated to a significant extent. Which means that when you do some damage with high explosive, or you get that penetrating shell, you would generally expect per shell less damage than the vast majority of your counterparts. But you now have the consistency to be able to get those high explosive penetrations. But as we can see here, this Dougie has presented a flat broadside. And as we fire in our first armour piercing salvo using our initial high explosive to gauge the range, we pick up a Citadel and just shy of 6,000 damage in a single salvo. And that's nice to achieve at 12.5km range. And we automatically switch back to Nicholas here, but notice how in our second salvo, as soon as the Dougie turned away and got rid of that flat broadside, our shells ricocheted, i.e. our armour piercing shells. So we can see the limitation factor still. But as soon as that happens, or we find a more viable target that's going to be more susceptible to our high explosives, such as Nicholas, we can switch targets, and our fast reload means we have the flexibility to adapt to a new target. Now at this point, we switch back to Akuma, and because they're presenting the flat broadside, we bring in the armour piercing, and we tear them to shreds. A 12,000 damage Citadel salvo, whereby we get 3 Citadels. Then we throw in a follow-up salvo, another Citadel. We're hoping to finish them off. A little bit unfortunate we didn't get them there, 2 over penetrations, but still we'll take it. And the third salvo picks up our second kill. And the Dougie from earlier is pulling back, showing a slightly angled broadside and then disappearing off into the distance, although they may open fire on us. Indeed they are. Priority target is telling us they're aiming at us, or someone is, and we see them on screen and their shells incoming. And then we see a Wyoming off in the distance, i.e. the tier 4 American battleship. Now at this point we'd love to start raining some fires on the Wyoming, because they're a much slower ship than the Dougie, they're less manoeuvrable, and at these ranges it's going to be a case of us trying to get some accurate shells onto either target, the Wyoming having less of a factor to move out of the way. Because the problem with German shells in general, I've found, and I believe it's a community consensus, or it's a general trait of them, is that whilst they have quite a high muzzle velocity to begin with, indeed the Konigsberg shells have a 960 meters per second muzzle velocity to start with, they suffer from a massive muzzle velocity drop off whilst in flight, especially at longer ranges, and that really does affect the armour piercing shells in particular. which is why they're very lofty shells or very slow shells. Therefore we want to engage the Wyoming because they're a much easier target to hit. They're not going to be able to dodge as easily. And here we switch to high explosive to articulate how the buff benefits us. Whereby we're going to see when we hit, we've got a much higher likelihood of scoring penetrations. Already we have 3 shells break, but most likely hitting the rear turrets, and we do get 1 penetration and we cause a fire. Now your fire chance is 8% in this ship as standard. You don't have a very good fire chance, but there, 4 penetrations, 2000 damage. Another salvo goes in, 1 penetration, 2 breakers, but we're heading towards the back of the ship in terms of where our shells are hitting. So we can see how we do a little bit more consistent damage with our high explosive, but we've had to switch targets to this Izokazi in front of us, who's trying to torpedo rush our Myogi. And we're going to make sure they regret their decision, albeit our accuracy is a little bit off at the moment. We follow up with a 3rd salvo, hoping to hit. As we can see, we do a considerable amount of damage. We set a fire, and our teammates are going to help finish off, although we pick up the kill due to the fire. And here with another Dougie showing their broadside, we engage with the armour piercing. At first our shells falling a little bit towards their rear, not picking up a citadel, 4 over penetrations. But our 2nd salvo is aimed more towards the centre, and we're starting to rack up the damage. No citadels yet, unfortunately. Shells going perhaps a little bit too high. And as the Dougie starts to angle towards us and points their bow towards us, we switch to the high explosive. And we're going to get that more reliable high explosive damage. 6 penetrating hits, 2 incapacitations, including a main gun. Throwing some armour piercing there a little bit carelessly. We should have waited. Bode our time, I should say. And here we're just waiting for the Dougie to turn its broadside. They seem to be set on engaging someone off to a different side. We could use our torpedoes, but our armour piercing will get the job done, we reckon. We're throwing the salvo, picking up 3 citadels and knocking them out of the game. Kill number 4. And here we get fortunate to only receive over penetrations from the enemy Wyoming, who seems to be aiming at us. Although priority target didn't show that as far as we remember. We weren't looking at the time. And now we're going to make our way in towards the centre of the map to try and close the distance and torpedo rush the Wyoming. Now we'd like to do this simply because we feel confident that the Wyoming is set on heading towards Bravo as well. And if we can close the distance rapidly enough, we should be able to get the torpedoes in and also hit them on the broadside with some armour piercing. Whilst we're waiting for the Wyoming to get a little bit closer, notice how we're slowing down here in order to try and shoot over the landmass, although unfortunately getting used to the flat gun arcs of the Konigsberg, and indeed German ships in general, can take some time, as only our A turret, i.e. our bow mounted turret, is getting over the landmass off to what would be our starboard side currently. And here we can see another fire set. We're not getting any penetrations, but our shells are landing on the gun turrets rather than the deck armour. But as soon as we start to get shells hit the deck armour, we're getting through. And here with the Wyoming turning broadside, we decide to go for armour piercing. 2 over penetrations at that point. But we're getting roughly the same damage currently as we would be if we're using high explosive, but that's probably our accuracy, rather than the shells being bad. And here we start to open up with some armour piercing. We pick up our Confederate award and we can see how we're doing significantly more damage now. A nice 2,500 damage salvo there. Just shy of 4,000 damage in the 2nd salvo. And we turn our bow in towards the Wyoming to dodge the incoming fire from their main batteries. And RNG really favours us here as every shell goes wide. We seem to come through completely unscathed. And we push onwards. Lobbing in some armour piercing towards the upper side deck armour. Unfortunately not getting through, and this is where we should have perhaps switched to high explosive and aimed towards the bow to try and break that up, as it seems to not be saturated. And our teammates finish off the job of our friendly Dougies. And there's only 2 enemy ships left, and we'd love to pick up a Kraken at this point, and perhaps there's even a high caliber in it for us, as there are only 2 battleships aside in this game, meaning the total health pool both teams is going to be rather low. And we're moving towards the Dougie from earlier, the one we pushed all the way back, or helped to push all the way back. And there's also an enemy Izokazi, who we're not too worried about. They're a long way away, and we're using our hydroacoustic, one of the key traits of the German cruiser line, and German lines in general, in order to make sure the torpedoes are not coming our way. We fire in our initial salvo to get an idea of the overall lead we need to give the Dougie, and then switch to armour piercing on their broadside, although they're turning away. As we can see here, as they turned away, we only got 1 penetration and 2 ricochets, highlighting how the armour piercing is so dependent on your opponent, providing that perfect broadside. So here we're having to switch back to high explosive, and we get 5 ricochets there, which completes our point. But now that we do have the lead, we can get the consistent damage up with the high explosive. To do with our accuracy this time, not the buff. And we set a fire, so that's going to gradually burn down their health. We pick up the high caliber, we creep it in there. As we can see, as everyone lobs in the shells, we pick up our Kraken, making it our 5th kill. And now it's just a case of finishing off the enemy Izokazi. And what we've hopefully seen throughout this game is how the Konigsberg has benefited from the buff to its high explosive, not in terms of being a more high explosive dominant ship anymore. Instead, you just have a little bit more versatility, you have some more options. It's not a case of waiting for that perfect broadside to appear, or your opponent to show that perfect broadside for your armour piercing. If they don't show it, you can always bring about your high explosive and do considerable damage. And therefore, you're likely to be able to pick up fires, where you've still got that base 8% fire chance, which isn't great, but you can make it work. But you can just get that more consistent high explosive and fire damage out there, and then bring in the armour piercing to help you out when it's required. And here we're trying to creep in our 6th kill, that looks a good salvo. Wasn't too bad, knocked out the torpedo tubes, but unfortunately it's not enough as our teammates finish off the job, and it's time for us to take a look at the post-game stats. A rather simple game in the end. We can see that our battle performance consisted of 84,288 HP of damage, made up of 154 target hits for our main battery, 1 aircraft shot down, 5 module incapacitations, 5 enemy ships destroyed, 6 fires set, 9 citadel hits, and 1 base defend. And on top of that we picked up the 3 heroic achievements, the ones we love to see. Firstly, Confederate, for damaging at least 6 enemy ships, where the damage caused to each ship must exceed 20% of their normal health pool. The Kraken Unleashed, for destroying 5 or more enemy ships in a single battle. And the third and final one, High Caliber, for damaging at least 4 enemy ships, where the damage caused must exceed 30% of the total health pool of all the ships in the enemy team. Looking at the team scores, we can see that we topped our team in terms of base experience earned, picking up 1,637. Now we were a significant margin ahead of the rest of our team, but we did not carry our team, it was a team effort to achieve the victory. Our focus was on dealing the maximum possible damage, using the right shell at the right time for each foe. A number of our teammates did their job very effectively in providing vision for us and also taking the objectives. Therefore, it all balances out in the end. We're not one individual winning it for our team, we're part of a collective effort. Looking at our detailed report, we only have one key item to note here, and it truly echoes the sentiment of this video, that whilst the high explosive has been buffed for German cruisers, it is not going to detract from your key traits, i.e. your potent armour piercing. Looking at our damage caused for our main battery, note how we fired approximately the same number of armour piercing shells as we did high explosive, and hit with roughly the same number. We dealt double, if not slightly over double, the amount of damage with our armour piercing compared to what we did for our high explosive, because we used our armour piercing shells at the right moments when our opponents exposed full broadsides to maximise our damage, particularly via citadel hits. Our high explosive achieved a notable amount of damage thanks to the recent buff, providing it with a more consistent platform on which to do damage, i.e. that increased penetration. And finally, coming on to our credits and experience earned, we can see that after additions and deductions, we walked away with 165,565 silver credits and 4,912 Captain XP. To conclude, hopefully today we've demonstrated that whilst the buff to German cruiser high explosive penetration is a pleasant one, and it provides you with additional options for engaging those foes who refuse to present the perfect broadside for your armour piercing shells, it is not a major game changer. The low high explosive damage in general attributed to German cruisers and German ships, in the case of the Konigsberg a maximum of 1,700, means that you'll still be chipping off health at longer distances through consecutive salvos, much like you would if you were just waiting for the fires to be set by your high explosive shells when the shells do not penetrate anyway, i.e. prior to the buff. Therefore, use your high explosive shells more freely, but do not rule out the armour piercing, because as soon as your foe presents that perfect broadside, it's the shell that's going to bring you through to victory. And so I've been TX141, And if you have enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future World of Warships videos on my channel. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and fair seas.